Dollar knowledge.
Test your knowledge with Michael.
Which is exactly what we're going to do today.
Right. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. Or I should say, welcome to you, the listener. Because today we're doing something a little bit different. We are running through a highly interactive 5-question gauntlet.
Yeah, a quiz, basically.
Exactly, a quiz. And we're using it to break down this massive invisible force that, quietly slashed the value of the $20 bill in your wallet while you were sleeping last night.
It's sneaky like that.
So sneaky. We are, of course, talking about inflation. It's notoriously misunderstood, incredibly powerful, and literally everywhere.
And we really need to establish right away that understanding inflation, it isn't just some, dry macroeconomics exercise for central bankers sitting in a boardroom.
Right. It's not just theory.
No, not at all. It is the fundamental baseline for your entire financial reality. I mean, it dictates capital flows, it dictates yields, and ultimately, it decides what your actual labor is worth in the real world, which is terrifying when you put it like that.
Oh, it is. If you don't understand the strict mechanics of how it's defined and measured, you're essentially... you're navigating a complex financial system totally blindfolded.
Which is why we want you to actively play along with us today. I'm going to present 5 specific questions along with multiple choice options, and I want you to mentally lock in your answer before we break down the logic.
No cheating. Lock it in.
Right. No fast forwarding. So let's jump right into question 1, because before we can fight the beast, we have to know exactly what it looks like.
The definition.
Yes, the core definition. So here is the prompt. What is the exact definition of inflation? And here are your 4 options. Is it A, a continuous rise in prices?
Okay.
Is it B, a one-time price increase? C, a government deficit? Or is it D, the erosion of the value of money?
So as you lock in your mental answer for this, I want you to really consider the difference between a root cause, a mechanism, and a symptom.
That's a huge hint. Because I know a lot of people, and frankly, a lot of financial commentators on TV, who would aggressively argue for option C, a government deficit.
Oh, yeah, you hear that all the time.
Right. The whole narrative is that government spending literally is inflation. But looking purely at the mechanics, while a deficit might act as the fuel, it isn't the fire itself.
Exactly. It's a catalyst maybe, but not the definition.
But the more tempting choice for me personally is option D, the erosion of the value of money. Because from a consumer perspective, sitting at the grocery store, that is exactly what we feel.
It's the lived experience.
Right. You hand over the same physical currency, but you get way less purchasing power back. Your money has literally eroded.
And it is incredibly common to gravitate toward option D for that exact reason. But the mathematically correct answer is actually A.
Wait, really? Just A?
Just A. Inflation is strictly defined as a continuous rise in prices.
So a continuous rise in prices, not the erosion of the money itself.
Right. And this goes back to my hint about mechanism versus symptom. Option D, the erosion of money's value, is an absolutely real phenomenon, but it's the result of inflation.
Okay. The symptom.
Yes. When prices continuously rise across a broad spectrum of the economy, the inherent purchasing power of the currency declines. So the rising prices are the mechanism, and the loss of purchasing power is the symptom.
Okay, I want to zero in on the word continuous here, because option B was a one-time price increase. And I feel like people mix up supply shocks with systemic inflation all the time.
Sure.
Like, say a major geopolitical conflict breaks out, right? And oil suddenly spikes to $150 a barrel. Airfare goes up, shipping goes up, everything gets super expensive. Why isn't that just called inflation?
Because a one-time supply shock doesn't represent a fundamental ongoing degradation of the currency. It's a temporary repricing of one specific input.
So just a bump.
Right. Think of it like taking a single step up a staircase. You expend some energy, you move to a higher price level, but then you stop. You're on a new flat landing. The economy absorbs that shock and stabilizes.
Okay, a staircase. I like that.
But true inflation, that continuous rise in prices, is like being stuck on an upward-moving escalator.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you never get to rest on a landing. The floor beneath you just keeps grinding upward, compounding month after month.
The escalator versus the stairs. That distinction is actually crucial, because misdiagnosing it would lead to massive policy errors, right?
Absolutely massive.
Because if central banks mistake a single step up the stairs, like, say, a temporary supply chain bottleneck, for an upward-moving escalator, They might panic. They'd hike interest rates aggressively to crush demand.
Exactly. They'd be deploying a permanent, heavy-handed monetary solution for a totally temporary logistical problem.
Which could trigger a completely unnecessary recession.
Precisely. Which is why the exact definition matters so much. You really have to know if the underlying structure of prices is continuously moving or if it just absorbed a single shock.
Okay, so if we agree that we're trying to figure out whether or not we're stuck on this economic escalator, the immediate challenge becomes tracking our speed.
Right, the measurement.
Which brings us to question 2. How is inflation measured? So here are your 4 options. Is it A, through random surveys of product prices at supermarkets? Is it B, by checking the prices of a fixed basket of goods? C, by checking a basket of goods that changes every quarter? Or D, through a survey conducted among businesses?
This question really gets to the heart of how economists try to filter out human behavior to find a pure statistical signal.
Now, I'm going to push back a bit on what traditional textbooks might say here, because logically, option C makes the most sense to me. A basket of goods that changes every quarter.
And why is that?
Because consumer habits are incredibly dynamic. If the price of beef skyrockets, people don't just blindly keep buying the exact same amount of beef, right?
No, they substitute it.
Exactly, they buy chicken instead. So if the basket we're measuring doesn't adapt to reflect that reality, aren't we overstating the actual cost of living? Shouldn't the measurement change to reflect what people are actually buying?
It's a highly sophisticated argument, and honestly, substitution bias is a massive debate among economists.
Saying that.
Well, no. To strictly measure inflation, the correct answer is B. It's measured by checking the prices of a fixed basket of goods.
Really? We hold the basket completely static even when we know consumers are shifting their behavior.
We have to. If you're trying to measure the pure price mechanism, that continuous rise we defined in question 1, you absolutely have to isolate your variables.
Okay, explain that.
Think about measuring the fuel efficiency of a car. To get an accurate reading, you have to drive the exact same route under the exact same conditions every single time.
Right.
If you constantly change the route to avoid traffic, you introduce too many variables. You wouldn't know if the car's engine is performing worse or if you're just driving up a steeper hill today.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. So if you swap out beef for chicken in the basket, you no longer know if the total costs change because the currency lost value or just because you decided to measure a fundamentally cheaper food.
Exactly. A fixed basket of goods essentially freezes consumer behavior in place. It takes a predetermined allocation of, housing, transportation, food, medical care, and it just holds it steady.
So it's locked in forever.
Well, not for eternity. Statisticians do update the weightings periodically to reflect major long-term technological and societal shifts. But over the measurement period itself, it must remain static. That fixed route is the only way to observe the pure volatility of the currency.
It acts like the ultimate control group in this giant macroeconomic experiment.
That's a great way to put it.
But that setup reveals a fascinating vulnerability to me. If we're completely relying on this carefully curated fixed basket to define our entire economic reality, then whoever controls that basket holds an enormous amount of systemic power.
Oh, absolutely. The power to define reality.
Which is the perfect transition to question 3, who measures inflation? Let's look at the options. Is it A, the U.S. Central Bank, also known as the Fed, B, the government, C, commercial banks, or D, the Central Bureau of Statistics?
Consider the incentives here. Because in any complex system, whoever controls the data controls the narrative.
Well, let's look at the big players. The central bank and the federal government are the ones making trillion-dollar decisions based on this exact data, right?
Right.
The Fed sets interest rates based on it. The government adjusts tax brackets and entitlement payouts based on it. Since they have the PhDs and the mandate to steer the ship, it stands to reason they should be the ones calculating the speed. I could easily argue for A or B.
It sounds super efficient in theory, but the correct answer is D, the Central Bureau of Statistics.
So neither the central bank nor the government.
Neither. And this is a foundational issue of institutional integrity. The entity measuring the data has to be rigorously firewalled from the entities executing monetary and fiscal policy.
Because of the conflict of interest.
It would be an astronomical conflict of interest. Let's just examine the sheer scale of the financial incentives here. Think about the federal government.
Okay.
They have billions of dollars in Treasury inflation-protected securities, or TIPS, where the payout is directly tied to the official inflation rate.
Right.
They also have huge programs like Social Security, which require automatic cost of living adjustments based on inflation. If the government was allowed to grade its own homework,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
there would be a massive multi-billion-dollar financial incentive to just subtly tweak the methodology, alter that fixed basket, and artificially underreport the inflation number to save the Treasury money.
Not to mention the political incentive to make the economy look amazing right before an election cycle.
Exactly. They'd basically be writing their own report card.
And the central bank has a similar conflict, don't they?
Absolutely. A central bank's primary mandate is price stability. If the Fed were responsible for calculating the inflation rate, there would be an inherent, perhaps even subconscious temptation to produce data that validates their own monetary policy.
Like a company auditing its own financial statements.
Exactly. It just doesn't work.
So if the government and the central bank are the players moving the ball down the field, the Central Bureau of Statistics has to be the impartial referee.
That is their sole purpose. They exist to collect the raw data, check the prices in that fixed basket across thousands of locations, and just publish the facts without bias.
Right.
They don't care if a high inflation print forces the central bank into a brutal tightening cycle, and they don't care if it creates a political nightmare for the sitting president.
Right.
Without that independent referee, global bond markets would completely lose faith in the currency.
You absolutely have to have trust in the scoreboard. Okay, so we've established the definition, we understand the fixed basket, and we have an independent referee. The next variable is time.
Yes.
Question 4. How frequently is inflation published? Are we looking at A, every year, B, every quarter, C, every month, or D, every week?
Think about the pace of the modern financial system versus the reality of actual data collection.
Well, we live in an era of hyper-financialization, right? Algorithms are executing trades in fractions of a millisecond. We have API feeds from retailers, live scanner data from grocery chains.
Real-time commodity pricing, yeah.
Exactly. So given the technology we have today, and given how critical this metric is for everything, I would assume we want the highest frequency data possible. I guess D, weekly. Why wait when we can track it almost instantly?
It's a completely logical assumption in the information age. But the correct answer is C. Inflation is published every month.
Wait, why restrict it to a monthly release if we have the technological capacity to gather it faster?
Because in macroeconomics, you are constantly fighting a battle between signal and noise. Higher frequency doesn't necessarily mean higher quality. If you publish inflation data every single week, the metric becomes incredibly noisy.
By noisy, do you mean it captures too much temporary volatility?
Exactly. Think about the sheer number of transient anomalies that can happen in a random 7-day window. Like a severe hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, and suddenly regional fuel and building material prices spike for 5 days. Or a massive retail chain decides to liquidate excess inventory over a holiday weekend, which artificially drags down the average price of apparel.
Oh, I see.
If you feed weekly, highly volatile data into the system, markets would overreact to a weather event, and policymakers might misinterpret a weekend clearance sale as some kind of deflationary spiral.
Right. You don't want the central bank shifting the yield curve of the global reserve currency just because of a temporary freeze in Florida.
Exactly. It's like trying to assess global climate change by looking at the thermometer outside your window on a random Tuesday. The time frame is just too narrow.
Okay, that makes sense. But conversely, why not smooth it out even further? Why not publish every quarter or just once a year?
Because then the lag effect becomes dangerous. Let's go back to our escalator analogy.
Right, the upward moving escalator.
If that inflation escalator suddenly accelerates and prices start compounding rapidly, central banks cannot afford to wait a year or even 3 months to confirm the trend.
Because it would be too late.
Way too late. Monetary policy operates with a long lag, meaning if the Fed raises interest rates today, it takes months for that tightening to actually cool down the real economy. If they only receive data quarterly, they're essentially driving a massive vehicle while looking in the rearview mirror.
Wow.
By the time they finally hit the brakes, inflation might already be deeply entrenched in consumer psychology. So a monthly cadence is basically the macroeconomic Goldilocks zone.
Not too fast, not too slow.
Right. It's broad enough to smooth out the weekly statistical noise, but frequent enough to give policymakers an accurate, actionable trend line.
A Goldilocks zone.
Oh.
I love that. All right, that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. We've mapped out the mechanics of how inflation operates and how it's measured, but now we really need to examine the actual fallout.
The real-world consequences.
Yes. Question 5. What damages are caused by inflation? Here are the choices. Is it A, erosion of the value of money, B, an increase in economic inequality, C, erosion of the nominal wage, or D, all of the above are correct?
This is where the mathematical theory really collides with the reality of our standard of living.
Okay, I'm looking at these options and relying on the logic we established right out of the gate in question 1. Back then, we clarified that while the erosion of the value of money wasn't the definition of inflation, it was absolutely the symptom or the result.
That's correct. Good memory.
So question 5 is asking about the damages or results. I know for a fact that option A is a correct statement. And, in a multiple choice format, if one specific damage is definitively true, it makes me highly suspect that D, all of the above, is the intended answer.
Your deduction is spot on. The correct answer is D, all of the above. Broad, continuous inflation triggers all three of those systemic damages.
Let's really dissect these, because while the erosion of money's value is pretty intuitive, your savings account effectively leaks purchasing power every month, the other two damages are far more complex.
They are.
Let's look at option C, the erosion of the nominal wage. Why is this so insidious for the labor market?
To understand the damage here, you really have to separate nominal from real. The nominal wage is just the absolute dollar amount you are paid. Let's say a worker signs a contract for $60,000 a year.
Okay, that's the nominal figure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, if the fixed basket of goods we discussed earlier suddenly requires $66,000 to purchase because of inflation, and that worker's salary remains fixed at $60,000, they are mathematically poorer.
Even though their paycheck didn't change at all.
Right. Their nominal wage is static, but their real wage, their actual yield in terms of purchasing power, has been severely eroded. They are trading the exact same amount of time, energy, and expertise to the market, but the market is silently extracting value from that labor.
That is brutal.
It is, and it introduces a deep friction into the economy because wages are historically what we call sticky. Prices for goods and services adjust upward relatively quickly, but corporate payrolls take much longer to adapt. During that lag, the worker absorbs the entire loss.
Which leads directly into option B, the increase in economic inequality. This is perhaps the most heavily debated consequence out there. How does a broad rise in prices inherently drive a wedge between different economic classes?
It really comes down to the mechanics of how different cohorts store their wealth and generate income. It's closely tied to what economists call the Cantillon effect.
The Cantillon effect.
Yeah, it's the idea that newly created money doesn't enter the economy evenly.
Yeah.
It usually enters through the credit and banking system, which benefits those closest to the capital first.
So asset owners versus wage earners.
Exactly. Think about who relies entirely on nominal wages and holds their limited reserves in cash.
Yeah.
It's the working and middle classes. They are fully exposed to the erosion we just described.
Yeah.
Furthermore, they spend a significantly higher percentage of their total income on the inelastic components of that fixed basket: food, energy, shelter. So they get hit simultaneously by a shrinking real wage and rising core costs.
It's a complete vice grip on the middle class. But then, how does the top tier actually benefit from this environment?
Because capital at the top tier isn't just sitting in a checking account, and it isn't strictly tied to an hourly nominal wage. It's deployed in hard assets: real estate, equities, commodities, corporate ownership.
Ah, I see.
When systemic inflation runs hot, the nominal value of those hard assets generally inflates right alongside it. If you own a massive portfolio of commercial real estate, the rising cost of living allows you to increase rents, and the nominal value of your property just surges.
So the asset owner's net worth is inherently hedged against the inflation or even accelerated by it.
Exactly.
While the wage earner is fundamentally shorting inflation just by holding cash and relying on a salary. The wealth gap widens automatically, completely independent of individual merit or work ethic.
That is exactly the mechanism. Inflation acts as a highly regressive, invisible tax. It systematically transfers purchasing power away from those who hold fiat currency and earn fixed wages, and shifts it directly toward those who leverage debt and hold hard assets. It's a silent restructuring of societal wealth.
Wow. Let's take a step back and look at the entire board here, because we have covered a massive amount of macroeconomic territory today.
We really have.
First of all, thank you to everyone who played along with the gauntlet. We established that inflation is not a one-time shock to the system. It is the continuous escalator of rising prices.
Right.
We explored how economists isolate that signal by tracking a strictly fixed basket of goods, measured by a rigorously independent referee, the Central Bureau of Statistics, to eliminate political conflicts of interest.
Crucial.
We learned they report this data on a monthly cadence to strike the perfect Goldilocks balance between signal and noise. And finally, we unpacked the severe structural damages, how inflation acts as an invisible tax that erodes savings, silently cuts real wages, and mathematically widens economic inequality by rewarding asset owners at the expense of wage earners.
It is a profound interlocking system, and honestly, once you understand the strict definitions and the incentives behind the measurements, the entire global economy makes a whole lot more sense.
It really does. We've spent this entire deep dive examining how inflation operates and how it directly impacts the consumer, the worker, and the asset owner. But we want to leave you with a final, slightly different perspective to mull over.
Oh, this is a good one.
Think about the ultimate beneficiary of inflation. Who is the single largest debtor in the global economy? It's the government. Sovereign states hold trillions upon trillions of dollars in national debt. And just as inflation silently erodes the value of your savings, it also silently erodes the real value of debt.
It's a fascinating dynamic to consider.
It really is.
Yeah.
So next time you see an inflationary spike
Yeah.
and you watch policymakers rush to the microphones promising to fight the continuous rise in prices, you have to ask yourself a very cynical question. Is the entity holding the fire hose genuinely trying to put out the fire? Or are they secretly enjoying the warmth, knowing their massive national debt just got mathematically cheaper to pay off?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Keep questioning the underlying mechanics, keep your eye on that fixed basket, and we will see you next time.